Into this first part of the social contract. So I don't think we really formally got into the social contract last time.
I think
So
we just kind of started to discuss
yeah, so I'm going to start with the second page actually of our new handout, with this famous quote in chapter 6, and then we'll kind of go back and forth a little bit in the first part of the social contract. But this is the challenge for Rousseau, okay? And this is on the bottom left of 432, chapter 6. He says, "Find a form of association which defends and protects all common forces, with all common forces, the person and goods of each associate, and by means of which each one, while uniting with all, nevertheless only obeys himself and remains as free as before." This is the fundamental problem for which the social contract provides the solution, okay? That's a lot. That's a high expectation. A form of association which defends and protects with all the common forces, everybody's power, the person and goods of every person, and by means of which, and this is the hard part, while uniting with all, nevertheless, each person only obeys himself and remains as free as before. Okay. Now, what he thinks most democratic systems are like is they're majoritarian, right? So the majority rules in any particular case. And the liberal thinkers say, well, whatever the majority rules in Parliament, for instance, is everybody's will because they've agreed to obey it. But Rousseau thinks this is not good enough. The minority will feel disenfranchised. There will be division, which causes trouble. And so his challenge is how to create a social contract in which everyone can agree and therefore feels that at all times this really represents their will, okay? Now, a Lockean type of liberal would say that's too high of a bar. That basically when you get to the point of wanting consensus, you have to use measures to achieve consensus, which are not very democratic.
Get that consensus, or wait, I'm confused what you're saying.
Like Locke would say, if you want to try to achieve consensus, you're going to have to use measures that force too much unanimity. Like you're going to have that established church, for instance, that Locke doesn't like, or you're going to have very strict rules about speech, which Locke wouldn't like, okay? Now, again, surprisingly, Rousseau is not necessarily against these types of measures through law, through socialization. Now, he starts off in the first part of the social contract just kind of reminding us of some of the things he's already established in the discourse that you read. He discusses, for instance, that in nature, no one can really ultimately overpower another, that people are free, that they feel free, that they cannot take slaves because they simply can't hold them. So slavery and the use of dominance generally is unnatural. And it's the state of nature sets the standard for Rousseau, not that he wants us to go back to that, because as we've said before, we can't. But as far as how people feel and the freedom, the feeling of freedom that they have, that sets the standard for what he wants. He takes on Thomas Hobbes in chapter 3, which is entitled On the Right of the Strongest, and he disputes Hobbes's view of the social contract. Remember that Hobbes thought that even if you were forced to the social contract, even if it was done through conquest, or in his day, people agreed to the social contract because the king was powerful and had troops. That was still a valid contract in his view, done freely. And Rousseau disagrees with that, okay? That there is no freedom of agreement if you've been coerced and out of fear you agree. So he says, on the bottom left of 429, obey the powers that be. If that means giving into force, the precept is sound but superfluous. I reply, okay, to that, obey the powers that be. I reply, it will never be violated. All power comes from God, I admit it, but so does every disease. Does this mean that calling a physician is prohibited? If a brigand takes me by surprise at the edge of the wooded area, is it not only the case that I must surrender my purse, but even that I am in good conscience, bound to surrender it if I were able to withhold it? Okay? This is the way that he looks at Hobbes's discussion of, how force creates agreement.
Okay, yeah, but if you talk about like being dominated, can't you say like your tight rules on free speech? I feel dominated because I can't say what I want, or can't have the religion I want.
Yes, and I think this is the reaction people often have as they move through the social contract, is you're replacing one type of coercion with another. You're replacing sort of honest coercion of the king with lots of troops or the conqueror with this ideological coercion that he develops, okay? Now, different, because he is not the most clear writer on the planet, people have disagreements about what he actually means by some of this stuff. So as we move through it, you'll have to see for yourself what you think, what he means by censorship, what he means by civil religion and how it's going to be imposed. But it does seem as though, he wants to create a very strong, ideology or set of ideas that people will be able to unite around. And he actually does use the term force them to be free, right? We can't have people disagreeing. So as we move through this, we have to judge for ourselves what he means. But he says at the end of that chapter, let us agree then that force does not bring about right, okay? And that one is obliged to obey only legitimate powers, and those would be powers that you willingly agree to, okay? Force does not bring about right. So whatever he's talking about with the censorship and the civil religion and so forth, he does not see as force, okay? And we may just disagree, with Rousseau on this. On the other hand, even if you think that Rousseau is proposing things that are too tyrannical or forceful to get this agreement, it does teach us what that fine line between democracy and tyranny is. Plato pointed this out in the Republic, that democracy is one step away from tyranny, literally, in his schema, right? And that's because when you give people that much power, they can choose to do whatever they want to with it. That's what he said. And so they can choose to give up their power to a dictator. And a lot of times in ancient history, this happened because people would feel overwhelmed. As individuals, they would feel powerless, and a very bad thing would happen, like an invasion or political turmoil, and they would not be able to handle this, even collectively. And so they would vote for a tyrant. Yeah. Is Vladimir Putin like that? In a way? Or borderline? He's democratically elected, correct?
Wow.
Sort of.
Technically.
Yeah.
Well, cooking may have been involved, but
Connected to something else.
Well, the Russians seem to need somebody who's a figurehead and somebody that he's seen by them as more than just their servant.
it's like that kind of like fatherly, like, and that's like a big cultural thing, like in Russia, just from, the time of the czars to, like, there was this quick transition to like, okay, well now we're communist, but now we don't like this, we want to be democratic. So they really haven't had like a good like tenure of, a nice Freedom House score, for example.
They haven't. No, they've never really had what we would consider a well-run democracy under any circumstances. And they do have this, maybe you might say, hangover from all those years under the czars of wanting to look up to these great men, and Putin certainly plays the part. This is why he spends so much time looking as good as he can, which isn't very good, but
Did he go
on the
from,
horse.
like president to prime minister back to president?
Yeah.
Pretty sure, and then he like readjusted the power from president or prime minister when he was prime minister so he could have more power, and then there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't go back to being president, so that's what he did. So it could just be an endless cycle.
Isn't that amazing? He can do what he wants. So is that a democratically elected leader, really? And yet the Russian people seem to this.
Well, I think they might be scared to
That's
come out
true.
against him, or for anybody to really oppose him.
It's hard to tell if a leader like that is really popular or not. If he's really unpopular, the Russian people do know how to rebel in recent experience.
Well, it seems like, I don't know, it's kind of what we're talking about. It seems like they want a strong leader. That's just their culture. That's what they've always historically had.
I assume that's why he pays such close attention to looking like the strong man, you know, like all the athletic stuff and everything. Otherwise, he wouldn't bother, but this is part of his power over people, is that kind of heroic image that he has.
I think not having a good point of reference is good, because I mean, you go from the Tsars to like Stalin, you know, it's just,
Yes.
what does, like, compared to pogroms and, you know, a more police state than they already have, this might not be so bad.
Yeah, and now
Which
he's
is
keeping them all concentrating on foreign, you know, involvements that he's getting them into, which is also another useful tool of a dictator. So, anyway, I bring that up because there are in our world, even for instance in China as well, different concepts of democratic involvement or government that represents the people, and they tend to, Singapore would be another example, they tend to be stronger on creating this cultural consensus and less strong on procedural democracy, you know, to where that's really downplayed. And so Rousseau's way of looking at this isn't totally foreign to us. It's just not the way Americans, you know, we're not comfortable with this. It seems like too much. Property would definitely be a place where most Americans, not all, but most Americans would have a problem with Rousseau, because he clearly, in the discourse as well as now in the social contract, identifies property as a major source of conflict, as really the source of conflict. And he wants to, in a way, do away with private property. Now, what he says is that the government will ultimately own the property. As far as what he says about property, I'll just read from 430. He says it is the relationship between things and not that between men that brings about war. Okay, that's a pretty strong statement. Okay, saying it's not human nature somehow that brings about war, it's things. Okay? I mean, you could easily dispute that, couldn't you? That it's not just things. This is what Karl Marx also thought, that property was the source of conflict. You can easily argue it's one source of conflict, but to reduce all conflict to property is tough, okay? Yeah. You have to do things like saying, well, this religious war is really about property. You know, it's really about property, right? Or this ideological conflict, that's just a smokescreen. It's property. Okay. People do that.
So, if I'm understanding right, he's saying that the government is the overall owners of everything, but the individuals also own it?
They more or less are granted by government the right to own it for as long as government says that they can.
Okay.
So yeah, let's see what he says about this on 435.
It's like he's wanting to get to communism, but it's not.
He's not quite there, right? I mean, full communism
It's like he
is...
really wants to be, but he's just not at the side.
It's like that final step, you just can't, he's not willing to take that final.
Right. That's a big question that we have for Rousseau is he really, you know, an advocate of communism, or is he talking about something else because he's so anti-property? But I mean, and maybe this is a distinction that doesn't matter as much as we're trying to make it. Full communism, according to the Marxist model, has the government planning everything as well as owning everything. There's no leasing or granting of, oh, here's your property, do what you want as long as I like it, with regulation and so forth. It's full ownership and planning. And Rousseau doesn't go all the way to planning everything. Even Thomas More, for those of you who took that intro class, even his version of socialism includes full planning. Okay, everybody will be told by the government, what they're going to do, where they're going to work, what they're going to produce. And there's going to be central planners. Rousseau doesn't go that far, so I guess this is why we don't normally call him a communist thinker.
But do you think he'd agree? Like if he sat down with Marx, and he was like, well, yeah, okay.
He might.
I didn't think about that.
He might.
He would.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe he just couldn't imagine that level of control yet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Thomas More did, though, before him. So it's not just about technology, because Thomas More didn't know at all what kind of technology we would have at our disposal to control people's, movements and everything, and really control a mass of people. But for whatever reason, I mean, it's possible that Rousseau.
Did Marx grab anything from Rousseau at all?
Yeah, he definitely read and he quotes from Rousseau.
I can't remember if you said that in the intro course or not.
I don't know if I point that out in that course either, but yeah, he's inspired partly by Rousseau. I mean, he's very well educated. He read all sorts of things, but you can tell from his writing, Rousseau is one of the influences there.
That's what I figured. Yeah.
Yeah, he totally agrees with this idea that the property is the
He
source
just
of
takes it
conflict.
the final step further, I think.
Yeah.
That's when he pulls the trigger on it.
Maybe that's a good word for it, yeah. I think that there are people, there are two types of people, basically. This is my personal philosophy. There's people, everybody gets frustrated with the fact that private property doesn't work out perfectly well, and that there's rich and there's poor, and there's a lot of messiness to the free economy, where people fall through the cracks, or overproduction is corrected when prices plummet, and it's just messy, so some people just get really, really frustrated with this, and they say, we've got to totally change this. We can't have this. It's too messy, it's too unpredictable, people get hurt. And they will explore, and we still have these people today, they will explore pretty strong measures for correcting that, and they're attracted to socialism and communism, but they don't tend to see, even now with the history that we have, they don't tend to see the drawbacks. They're